You won't believe the nerve of this woman, a total stranger, who thought she could turn my mom's private driveway into her personal parking spot. What happened next? Let's just say it didn't end well for Karen. Stay tuned to find out how my mom handled it like a pro. It was a bright Saturday morning, and the neighborhood was buzzing with its usual weekend energy. Kids were riding their bikes, neighbors were mowing their lawns, and the sweet smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. My mom had just settled in with her cup of tea, ready to enjoy a rare moment of peace. But little did she know, her quiet morning was about to be turned upside down. As she looked out the living room window, something caught her eye. Parked boldly in the middle of her driveway was a shiny black SUV, its tires firmly planted where they didn't belong. For a moment, she blinked, thinking maybe it was a delivery driver, someone who had mistakenly pulled in and would leave in a few minutes. But no one got out. The car just sat there, as if it belonged. My mom, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp eye for detail, frowned. Our family had dealt with this kind of thing before. The driveway was directly visible from the street, and over the years, it seemed to act like a magnet for the clueless and entitled. Still, my mom always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, so she decided to investigate before jumping to conclusions. She stepped outside, her slippers crunching on the gravel. The morning sun was warm on her face, but her mood was anything but sunny. As she approached the vehicle, she noticed the driver was still inside. A woman, probably in her late 40s, sat behind the wheel, scrolling through her phone, like she had all the time in the world. My mom tapped lightly on the driver's window. The woman looked up, startled, her sunglasses reflecting the glare of the sun. She lowered the window just enough to speak. "Hi there," my mom began, keeping her tone polite but firm. "This is private property. I'm going to have to ask you to move your car." The woman's reaction was nothing short of astounding. She didn't apologize or seem remotely embarrassed. Instead, she tilted her head, gave a half smile, and said, "Oh, I'll just be a minute. Don't worry about it." Mom's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me? This isn't a public parking lot. It's my driveway. You need to move your car now." But Karen, yes, at this point, it was clear we were dealing with the classic Karen, just shrugged. "I'm not blocking anything. I'll be out of here in a few minutes. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal? My mom couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was her property. She'd worked hard to maintain it, paying her dues and making sure everything was in order. The sheer audacity of someone brushing off her concern like it was nothing lit a spark of frustration inside her. "Look," my mom said, crossing her arms, "I'm asking you nicely. This is private property. If you don't move your car, I'll have no choice but to call someone to tow it." Karen's eyes widened, and for a moment, it seemed like she might comply. But instead of backing down, she scoffed. "You wouldn't do that. Who calls a tow truck for something so petty? You need to chill out, lady." By now, a few neighbors had started to notice the commotion. Ms. Grant from next door peered out her window, and Mr. Peterson, always eager to weigh in on neighborhood disputes, paused his lawnmower to watch the unfolding drama. My mom was well aware of the audience, but she wasn't about to let Karen's blatant disrespect slide. "This is your final warning," my mom said, her voice steady but firm. "Move your car, or I'll have it removed for you." Karen rolled her eyes. "Fine, call them. I'll be gone before they get here anyway. Good luck with that." My mom didn't bother responding. Instead, she turned on her heel and went back inside. She'd given Karen more chances than she deserved. If she wanted to test boundaries, she was about to learn exactly where those boundaries lay. Karen's audacity lingered in the air long after my mom had stepped back into the house. I could feel her frustration as she walked into the kitchen, her jaw clenched and her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "She really thinks she owns the world, doesn't she?" Mom muttered, half to herself. She wasn't one to get worked up easily, but this kind of blatant disrespect was enough to push anyone's buttons. Outside, Karen remained parked like a defiant monument to entitlement. She sat comfortably in her car, sunglasses perched on her nose, and her phone in hand, as if nothing at all was amiss. It was the kind of confidence, or ignorance, that could only come from someone who had spent far too long getting their way. I stood by the window, watching her, my own irritation bubbling up. "Are you seriously going to let her just sit there?" I asked. Mom shook her head. "No, but I'm done playing nice." Mom's next move. She grabbed her phone and dialed the non-emergency number for our local police department. Calm and composed, she explained the situation. A trespasser parked on her property, ignoring polite requests to leave. The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent over shortly. "They'll remind her what private property means," the dispatcher said. Hanging up the phone, Mom glanced at me. "If she wants to play stubborn, let's see how she likes it and when the law gets involved." We stood in the kitchen, the tension thick in the air as we waited. Every now and then, I'd peek out the window to see if Karen had come to her senses, but she was still there, scrolling through her phone, without a care in the world. Karen doubles down. When the police car finally pulled up, a wave of relief washed over me. The officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense air, stepped out and approached Karen's car. "Ma'am," he said, tapping lightly on her window. Karen looked up, startled. She hesitated before rolling it down. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with faux politeness. "We've received a complaint that you're parked on private property," the officer said. "The homeowner has asked you to move multiple times." Karen huffed, leaning back in her seat. "Oh, come on. I'm not hurting anyone. It's just a driveway." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is private property. You don't have permission to be here. I need you to move your vehicle immediately." Karen's attempted justification. Instead of complying, Karen launched into a rant. "This is ridiculous. I was only going to be here for a few minutes. I didn't think it was such a big deal. She's overreacting." The officer remained calm but firm. "It doesn't matter how long you plan to stay. This isn't your property. The homeowner has every right to ask you to leave." Karen's frustration was palpable. She threw her hands up in exasperation. "Fine, whatever. I'll move." But even as she said the words, she made no move to actually start her car. She sat there, glaring at the officer and then at our house, as if daring someone to push her further. The tipping point. At this point, the officer had had enough. "Ma'am, if you don't move your car right now, I'll have no choice but to issue a citation for trespassing." The word citation seemed to hit a nerve. Karen's confident facade cracked just a little, but she still hesitated, as if trying to decide whether her pride was worth the trouble. Meanwhile, the neighbors had begun to gather, subtly watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Grant stood on her porch, watering a potted plant that didn't really need it. Mr. Peterson leaned on his fence, pretending to adjust a loose board. The kids who had been playing on the sidewalk were now sitting on their bikes, wide-eyed and whispering to each other. Karen, now very aware of her growing audience, finally started her car. The engine roared to life, but instead of driving away quietly, she rolled down her windows and shouted, "I hope you're happy. This is such a waste of everyone's time." Victory, but not without drama. As Karen sped off, the neighbors broke into quiet applause. My mom stood by the door, her arms crossed and a small smile playing on her lips. She wasn't one to gloat, but there was a certain satisfaction in standing up for herself and for her property. The officer approached the house, tipping his hat. "Well, that's taken care of," he said. "If you have any more trouble, don't hesitate to call us." "Thank you," Mom replied. As the police car drove away and the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm, I turned to my mom. "You handled that like a pro," I said. She shrugged, a twinkle in her eye. "Some people just need a little reminder that the world doesn't revolve around them." Karen's defiance was the kind of boldness that left you shaking your head. My mom had already done her part, approached her with patience, explained the situation, and even given her a chance to correct her mistake. But some people, like Karen, seemed to thrive on testing limits. As Karen leaned back in her seat, sunglasses perched arrogantly on her nose, she began scrolling through her phone again. It was almost as if my mom's words had fallen on deaf ears. That sense of entitlement radiated from her, making it clear she didn't think the rules applied to her. Meanwhile, inside the house, my mom was on the phone with me. "She's still there," she said, exasperated. "Can you believe this woman? She told me to chill out like I was the one in the wrong." I could feel her frustration through the phone. "Want me to come over?" I asked. "No, not yet," Mom replied, her voice firm. "I'll handle this, but it's just so infuriating. What kind of person behaves like this?" The neighbors take notice, outside. The scene was drawing more attention by the minute. Mr. Peterson, now openly watching from his porch, had set aside his lawnmower and was leaning on his fence. Ms. Grant, always one for drama, was watering her already saturated flower beds, her eyes darting toward Karen's car. Even the kids from down the street had stopped riding their bikes and were now clustered together, whispering and pointing at the car in the driveway. Karen, oblivious or perhaps entirely unbothered by the growing audience, continued to sit in her car, her polished nails tapping on the screen of her phone. Every now and then, she'd glance toward the house, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. It was as if she thought this whole situation was amusing, a minor inconvenience she could brush off. Karen gets out of the car. The sound of the car door opening caught everyone's attention. Karen stepped out, slinging a designer bag over her shoulder. She was dressed in workout clothes that probably cost more than my mom's monthly grocery bill, and her expression was one of pure annoyance. She took a few steps toward the front door, her sneakers crunching on the gravel, and called out, "Hey lady, Are you really going to make a big deal out of this? It's just a driveway. From inside, my mom heard her and took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping outside again. The door creaked open, and my mom walked out, her posture straight and her expression calm but firm. Do you need something? Mom asked, her voice measured. Karen sighed dramatically, throwing her hands up. I just don't understand why you're being so difficult. It's a driveway. You're not even using it right now. Mom raised an eyebrow. That's not the point. It's my driveway. I shouldn't have to explain why you can't park here. Karen crossed her arms, her irritation growing. You don't own the road, you know. This is just a little patch of pavement. You're acting like it's a big deal when it's not. The situation heats up. The tension between the two women was palpable. Karen's voice had risen, loud enough for the neighbors to hear every word. Ms. Grant's watering can hovered midair, her eyes wide as she watched the confrontation. It might not be a big deal to you, my mom said, keeping her tone steady, but it's my property. That makes it a big deal to me. Now, I've asked you politely to move your car. What happens next is up to you. Karen scoffed. Oh, please. What are you going to do? Call the cops? At that, my mom simply shrugged. If that's what it takes. Karen's mouth opened as if to retort, but she hesitated. She wasn't expecting my mom to stand her ground like this. Instead of responding, she turned and walked back to her car, slamming the door shut behind her. The waiting game. For the next several minutes, nothing happened. Karen sat in her car, fuming, while my mom returned to the house. From the living room window, we could see her fidgeting in her seat, glancing at her phone, and occasionally looking toward the house. She's not going anywhere, I said, watching the scene unfold over a video call with my mom. I know, Mom replied, but I'm not going to let her get away with this. It was a standoff, plain and simple. Karen was too stubborn to admit she was in the wrong, and my mom wasn't about to let her entitlement slide. The moments of truth. After what felt like an eternity, Karen stepped out of her car again. This time, she didn't approach the house. Instead, she began pacing back and forth in the driveway, muttering to herself and gesturing animatedly. It was clear she was building up to something, though what exactly she was planning was anyone's guess. The neighbors, still watching, exchanged glances. What's she doing now? Mrs. Grant whispered to Mr. Peterson. No idea, he replied, shaking his head. But this is better than anything on TV. As Karen paced, my mom watched from the window, her expression unreadable. She wasn't one to back down, but even she had to admit that Karen's behavior was bordering on absurd. Karen's overconfidence was about to meet its match. My mom wasn't one to bluff, and her years of dealing with all kinds of neighborhood shenanigans had taught her a valuable lesson. Sometimes, you need to stand your ground firmly and decisively. Inside the house, my mom picked up her phone and dialed the local non-emergency police line. She wasn't one to escalate unnecessarily, but Karen had left her with no choice. The woman's dismissive attitude, blatant disrespect, and outright refusal to move the car had crossed every reasonable boundary. As the phone rang, my mom glanced out the window. Karen was now pacing around her car, her designer bag swinging with each exaggerated step. She occasionally glanced toward the house, likely wondering if my mom would actually follow through on her threat. When the operator picked up, my mom explained the situation succinctly. There's a woman parked in my driveway who refuses to leave. I've asked her several times to move her car, but she's refusing. I believe she's trespassing. The operator assured her that an officer would be dispatched to assess the situation. My mom hung up, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. She didn't enjoy confrontations, but this wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent for anyone who thought they could disrespect her property. Karen's rant begins. Outside, Karen had grown restless. By now, a few more neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, subtly watching the scene unfold. Karen, oblivious to, or perhaps fueled by, the growing audience, started ranting loudly. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, throwing her hands in the air. "It's a driveway, for crying out loud. Who even cares?" Mrs. Grant, who had been quietly observing from her porch, muttered under her breath. Apparently, she cares enough to make a scene. Karen, seemingly unaware of the snide remark, continued her tirade. "Some people just love to feel important. Control freaks. That's what this is about. Pure control." Inside, my mom watched Karen's dramatic performance with a raised eyebrow. "She's really digging herself into a hole," she said to me over the phone. "Let her," I replied. "The more she rants, the harder it'll be for her to backpedal when the cops show up." The arrival of the authorities. It didn't take long for a police cruiser to pull up. The sight of the black and white vehicle, seemed to drain some of the color from Karen's face, but she quickly masked it with a defiant scowl. The officer stepped out, adjusting his belt and surveying the scene. My mom met him at the end of the driveway, greeting him with her usual calm demeanor. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing toward Karen's car. "This woman has been parked in my driveway for over half an hour. I've asked her multiple times to leave, but she's refused." The officer nodded, taking in the information. He then turned to Karen, who was now standing stiffly by her car, arms crossed. "Ma'am," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Can you explain why you're parked here?" Karen rolled her eyes, her earlier confidence faltering slightly. "It's just a driveway," she said, her voice laced with irritation. "I wasn't hurting anyone. I only stopped for a few minutes. And then this woman started acting like I'd committed a crime." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is private property. If the homeowner has asked you to leave, you're required to comply. By refusing, you're technically trespassing." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the officer held up a hand. "I understand you might not think it's a big deal, but the law is clear. You can't park on someone else's property without permission." Karen's confidence crumbles. For the first time, Karen seemed genuinely unsettled. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice rising. "You're really going to make a big deal out of this? I wasn't even here that long." The officer didn't waver. "It doesn't matter how long you were here. What matters is that you were asked to leave, and you didn't. That's where the problem lies." By now, the small crowd of neighbors had grown. Whispers rippled through the group as they watched Karen's bravado crumble under the weight of the officer's calm authority. Karen glanced around, realizing she had no allies in this situation. "Fine," she muttered, throwing her hands up. "I'll move the car. Happy now?" The officer nodded. "Thank you. I'll need to see your license and registration first." Karen's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "It's standard procedure," the officer replied. "Since this incident involved trespassing, we need to document it. A citation to remember." Karen reluctantly handed over her documents, her face flushed with embarrassment. The officer returned to his cruiser, running her information while Karen stood by her car, glaring at the ground. A few minutes later, the officer returned with a clipboard. "Ma'am, I'm issuing you a citation for trespassing. This is a warning. If something like this happens again, the consequences will be more severe." Karen's jaw dropped. "You're giving me a ticket? Are you serious?" The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. This is a formal warning. I suggest you take it seriously." Karen snatched the ticket from his hand, muttering under her breath as she climbed back into her car. She started the engine, and with a screech of tires, sped off down the street. A lesson in respect. As Karen's car disappeared from view, a round of applause broke out among the neighbors. My mom couldn't help but smile as she thanked the officer for his help. "Hopefully, she learned her lesson," the officer said, tipping his hat before returning to his car. Mrs. Grant, ever the neighborhood commentator, called out, "Well done, dear. You handled that beautifully." My mom waved, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the driveway. It was about standing up for what was right. The next morning, the story of Karen's driveway debacle was the talk of the neighborhood. Mrs. Grant and Mr. Peterson, forever the local commentators, had spread the word to everyone within earshot. "Oh, you should have seen it," Mrs. Grant exclaimed to another neighbor as she gestured animatedly. "The nerve of that woman. But the way she stormed off. Classic." In the days that followed, my mom noticed something interesting. The usual culprits who occasionally loitered near our driveway or parked without permission were suddenly nowhere to be found. Word had spread that my mom wasn't someone to mess with when it came to respecting boundaries. For my mom, the incident was more than just a battle over a piece of pavement. It was a victory for standing up for herself and setting a clear precedent. She always taught me the importance of kindness and patience, but she also believed in drawing a line when those virtues were taken advantage of. A week later, she received a handwritten note in her mailbox. It wasn't signed, but the elegant handwriting suggested it might have been Karen's. "I'm sorry for the trouble I caused. I was having a rough day, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. Thank you for standing your ground and teaching me a lesson about respect." My mom smiled as she read the note. It wasn't about the apology. It was about knowing she'd done the right thing and, in some small way, made an impact. So, what's the moral of this story? Respect people's property and don't underestimate the quiet strength of someone standing their ground. My mom's experience with Karen has become a go-to story at family gatherings, always ending with laughter and the reminder that sometimes you've just got to teach a Karen a lesson. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more engaging content. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in my mom's shoes? Or have you ever dealt with a Karen moment We'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, stay kind, stay respectful, and don't park where you don't belong.